It's my job to explain geopolitics to investors, to companies, to decision makers around the world. And as you can imagine, the last 6 weeks or so have been probably the busiest 6 weeks of my life. And so I have about 19 and a half minutes ticking down, and I'm going to try to give you the most comprehensive breakdown I can of geopolitics and macroeconomics within that time. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Davos in Switzerland. And if you haven't heard, that's where self-obsessed talking heads like me go to get a pulse on what's happening in the world. And everybody's in Davos, there and afterwards, trying to figure out what's the story, what's the narrative, what's the one central arc that describes where we are in the world today and where we're going. And obviously, there were tons and tons of prognostications. There were all these comparisons of Trump's speech versus Carney's speech about how all this geopolitics and what it represents for the New World Order. But what I found for the first time possibly ever this Davos is that there actually wasn't one clean story you could tell about the world. And what I want to do today is spell out the three different stories that are operating in parallel that explains where the world is and where it's going. I want to start by addressing the elephant in the room, talk about Donald Trump. And this will show you how fragmented the world is becoming as can be measured even with data. But look, talking about Donald Trump, when you go around the world and you talk about Trump to so many people, you start developing a couple of pet peeves. And I have one pet peeve, which is people often say Trump is entirely unpredictable. Right? This is totally madman doctrine, totally unreliable. There's actually no point paying attention because we don't know what he's going to do next. And I disagree with that. And so I forced myself to sit down and try to come up with what is the best template we know, the best template we have of describing the life cycle of a Trump foreign policy. And what I came up with is this, the Trump swing, right? This 5-part framework that I think will help you understand any given Trump decision. The first step to a Trump foreign policy is the S, shock. You wake up one morning and you realize that the US might be annexing Greenland. You've realized that Canada might become the 51st state. Right? You woke up on April 2nd and you heard about all of the tariffs, about Liberation Day, about reworking the entire global economic order. A couple of times you might have woken up and heard about NATO. Maybe the US was pulling out of NATO and reversing, an 80-year plus history of transatlantic security, right? The first step is to always shock. And part of this happens because of what Trump's team calls muzzle velocity, right? This idea that you have to flood the zone, that the opponent is the media, not necessarily the opposition party, that you have to be constantly on top of every single news cycle so that you are always the agenda, right? But the problem with this is that the US's bureaucratic, democratic infrastructure isn't equipped to handle this, because the second step in this is waver, right? As soon as these sort of blunt policy announcements come out, you realize that bureaucratically, there's no solution for them. Right? The State Department wavers. We have Trump advisors, Kushner and Rubio, taking front stage, walking back some of Trump's statements. You have this wavering. The third step is to inflate. It's to basically say, this is our shocking goal, and actually we're absolutely going to be able to meet it. We want to put tariffs on China, and actually we had some negotiations, and now we have a quote-unquote handshake agreement, right, that they agreed to in London. Or the war in Ukraine, it'll stop in 24 hours, right? Or what's happening in Gaza, we all remember that horrific sort of AI-generated video came out about turning it into a Gaza Riviera, right? This inflation of American assets, American credibility. But what happens next is almost in reverse order usually. What happens next is the negotiations. And the negotiations are always theatrical, they're always performative, right? There's a rhetorical element to these. Think about how many series of negotiations have happened between Russia and Ukraine and the United States, right, over the last 18 months or so. Right? They've met in Saudi, they've met in Turkey, they've met in Qatar, they've met in Miami. In fact, they're going to do that again this weekend. The negotiations are always a very public element of Trump foreign policy. But what's the fifth step, right? What happens after all of this has happened? I think it's that Trump goes silent on all of the key policy dimensions, right? What is happening right now on the ground in the war in Ukraine? Right? What happened to reworking the global trading order? Right? We had tariffs at a certain level, and they've been reduced to about a third of that level right now. What happened to annexing Greenland? Right? Again, I remember when Trump made that speech in Davos, basically everything else got whipped off the agenda. There's no talk about Ukraine, no talk about Gaza, almost even nothing even about AI, because everyone was too worried talking about Greenland. And then that day there was a framework agreement, and we never heard about it again. Right? These are the stages to a Trump foreign policy. Someone said to me last time I presented this on the go silent part, doesn't Venezuela contradict that? And I think Venezuela actually is a central part of this, right? You might say that Venezuela is one of the first times where Trump actually did do something radical, carried out the capture of an external head of state. But I think it's worth asking what happened in the aftermath. Right? In the aftermath, do we see a serious reworking of US-Venezuelan, US-Latin American relations? Or did we see the persistence of the entirety of the Maduro regime? Right? Delcy Rodriguez basically carrying out the same economic and foreign policies. Right? All the oil that is promised to come from Venezuela to the United States, we all know will take billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure spend and at least a decade until it really hits the bottom line of American companies, right? I think this plays part of Trump's five-stage foreign policy. Shock, waver, inflate, negotiate, and then go silent. My second pet peeve is that people say, there's no Trump playbook. There's no Trump doctrine. You have to constantly rely on his Truth Social posts or his tweets to figure out what the grand strategy is. And I disagree with that too, because in November, the administration dropped this document kind of in the dead of night, and it didn't really get picked up in the same way that it usually does by the media and the think tanks. But it's equally important, and it's called the National Security Strategy. Right? It's a 36-page document where Trump's team lays out in incredibly blunt terms what their foreign policy is and what they want to do. And I realize you probably don't have time to read all 36 pages. I think you should. But if you wanted to know just three things from this, I'll tell you what they are. The first is that transactionalism is now the central pillar of American foreign policy. It's no longer about a values-based approach, right? You see no mention to democracy, to human rights, to the rule of law, to Bretton Woods institutions, to multilateralism. These are the things that we had in every single national security strategy up until now, right? But this makes it clear that America has interests. Those interests are to be put first, and it's that transactional nature that will define American foreign policy. The second pillar of this is that Europe is identified as the primary problem. Not China, not even Russia. Europe is the primary problem identified in Trump's national security strategy. And it goes in very far-reaching terms, and I just put a screenshot of some of it here. It talks about the economic decline that is real and Americans love to talk about. It says that it's eclipsed by the real and more stark prospect of civilizational erasure. Right? Effectively, these are culture war narratives dominating how American foreign policy hawks think about Europe and where it's going. It also talks about how if these trends continue, the continent will be unrecognizable in 20 years or less. Right? It's parroting a lot of the claims that right-wing or far-right parties make within Europe. And it's the first time we've seen this, right, in over 80 years. The third most interesting thing is there's a handful of advisors overriding the entire State Department and foreign policy apparatus. So usually a national security strategy would take years. You would consult hundreds of ambassadors, hundreds of experienced diplomats. Right? The entire foreign policy machinery would contribute ideas upwards. There'd be years of consultation. You'd come up with a document that everyone agrees with. For the first time in history, this document was written by no more than 6 people. Right? There's no consultation with the State Department. Most ambassadors have never seen this until it came out, of course, on Twitter. And what it tells you about how Trump's foreign policy operates is that you have to understand who the key influence makers are. And they're not the ones necessarily with the most public or official positions, right? These are people like Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, right? Increasingly Ronald Lauder, Stephen Miller, right, who takes care of internal security and homeland security and immigration, but it also has immense impacts on foreign policy, right? These key groups of advisors, Peter Thiel, right, when it comes to technology and some of that interface, these key advisors are overriding the hundreds of thousands of federal employees whose job it is to make foreign policy, right? And those are the people to watch out for as forward indicators of where this is going. Now, it's a lot of talk about Trump. I've reached about half my time. What I do want to focus our attention on is the fact that I think when we come back in 2027, and we're here in February, the number one thing we're going to be talking about isn't actually Trump. I think it's Europe's own populist extremist right, which will define the geopolitical agenda for the rest of this year. This is the second story that I see in the world today, right? And it's not the Trump story, but it's influenced by the Trump story. There's three big countries, fundamentally, that matter, right? The first is Germany. And in Germany, the AfD, for the first time a couple of months ago, started polling higher than any of the mainstream parties. And then we realized that it wasn't a blip, right? That was actually a sustained push seen across dozens of polls, right? This is an aggregation of a dozen or so polls conducted throughout Germany almost twice a week. And this is the first time that we've seen, an extremist far-right party really be polling in this way. And I think to say extremist far-right even is an understatement, really understanding what the AfD is, right? In no plain terms, the AfD has neo-Nazi roots, right? It is a party that is deeply opposed to all Muslim immigration into Germany, right? It advocates for Germany leaving the euro, leaving the EU, right? Can you imagine how different the European policy landscape would look like, whether you agree or disagree or what your political views are? Just imagine how different it would look like if the AfD was in power. In a couple of days, I'm going to go to the Munich Security Conference. And one of the really interesting things I picked up on is the fact that over the last decade, there's been this cordon sanitaire, right? This firewall. The AfD would never be invited, right, on principle to policy discussions, international convenings like the Munich Security Conference. This is the first year that they actually have been, right? And there's a lot of internal dissent and debate about this, but they have been because, agree with them or disagree with them, they're not softening their policy stance, and they're here to stay, right? These trend lines are more or less permanent for the next year. So we have to engage with them, right? That policy sphere is shifting in Germany and within Europe on how to engage with the far right. The second, and before I say that, actually, there's this interesting joke that you'll hear in Brussels or NATO circles. The first NATO Secretary General said that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, the German far right, and the Russians out. And of course, what you have today is the exact opposite on all of those fronts, right? The Russians are in, the Americans are out, and the German far right is back up again. And that's what reminds me of France, which is the next country I think you should be paying attention to. All the polls I've seen basically tell me that if the election happened tomorrow, Jordan Bardella, the 30-year-old heir-in-waiting of the National Rally, would be the next French leader, right? No matter who the opponent is. And of course, you might know that all of this traces back to France's snap election in 2024, where a coalition of left-wing parties kind of cobbled something together to put up a resistance to the right, the far right in France. That coalition has been fracturing, right, consistently over recent months. Bardella and the Rassemblement National is effectively an anti-immigration party, right? But they're more than that, because we know that these parties don't operate in isolation. We know they talk to their allies in different countries, and that their rise is coordinated and strategic, right? Not in isolation. And I think perhaps what's even more worrying isn't some of the RN's ideas, but their lack of ideas on a couple of fronts that have gone overlooked, specifically the economic front. Right? There are no real economic solutions in their mandate and their policy proposals to address France's economic woes, and they're deep economic problems. Right? We're talking about a country that has 5.8% deficit ratio to GDP. right? 117%, I think it is now, debt to GDP ratio. That's only behind countries like Italy and Greece. Right? Remember the pigs economies that we used to talk about 10, 15 years ago? It's actually now more costly for France to borrow money than it is for Italy. Right? This is the economic situation that France is in. And the party that is likely to become the next government has no economic answers to that. Right? That's worth watching out for. And then the third country is here at home, is the United Kingdom. I don't want to say too much about this because I know that everybody's following the news. I mean, I think the one thing worth stressing is the idea that when Labour won the election, just about 18 months ago, it did not win it, as everyone said at the time, in a landslide. It was not a landslide, right? They won 411 seats in Parliament based purely on a very efficient, strategic, fortuitous distribution of votes across the country, right? Just enough in every constituency, in most cases, to edge them over and give them the seat. But that distribution of votes had collapsed just as quickly. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. About half of Labour voters in 2024 now say they would vote for a different party, right? The Lib Dems are out of the woods. The Greens, for the first time, are polling in substantial numbers. And of course, Reform is very much leading this pack. In fact, Nigel Farage has been polling higher than anyone else consistently since about May of last year. And what you have here is a very different system to anything we've seen in the UK in decades, right? What you have here is something like a multi-party system. And this is exactly what happened in France in about 2017. And I make that connection because I think we're going to see more and more of that. I think we're going to see Keir Starmer, if he lasts the next couple of weeks and months, act more and more like Macron did in 2017. And what do I mean by that? Well, Macron won the election inheriting a multi-party system, but basically pretending that it was a two-party system, pretending that it was him versus Le Pen, that he was the last bastion of centrist hope against the far right. Right? And that's exactly what Starmer is likely to do over the next couple of years, is to focus all his energy on Farage. Right? He's going to pretend the Conservatives don't exist. He's going to pretend the Greens aren't actually surging in the polls. He's going to pretend that he is the one sole hope for the UK, kind of before this far-right extremism. And I think whatever happens over the next couple of weeks, the really key date to look out for is May, when the local and regional elections happen in the UK. And I think that's exactly when, and we're just about enough months away from then, that others in the Labour Party will start really thinking about their own leadership chances and mounting an opposition. I want to move swiftly on to talk about the rest of the world. I think too often we talk about Trump, we talk about Europe, and we stop there. I think some of the most interesting stories come from outside of that bubble. Right? And this is what I call geopolitical swing states. This is the third story that I think defines geopolitics today. And a geopolitical swing state, I mean, you've heard of the term swing state when it comes to American politics, right? States like Arizona or Pennsylvania that by themselves aren't huge, right? Don't have that many people, but they play an outsized role in the sort of domestic politics because of their strategic position, right? Similarly, I think there's these middle powers around the world that play an outsized role on the international scene, not because of their resources or their assets or because of how big or strong they are, but precisely because of their geostrategic position in the world today. Right? What kind of countries am I talking about? I'm talking about countries like India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Indonesia, Singapore, Brazil. Right? What unites all these countries is that they refuse to look at the world through a 1990s lens. How many of you have heard the term multipolarity? Show of hands, right? The idea that we exist in a multipolar world. Right? A few of you. It's become this kind of defining narrative in geopolitics. Everybody talks about it. I reject the idea of multipolarity outright. Right? I think multipolarity is basically applying a Cold War lens to what we see happening in the world today. Right? This idea that there are distinct camps that have ideological, economic, political alignment. And now there's not two, but rather three or four or five. And I think we don't see this at all. I think we see multi-alignment. And in multi-alignment, there are no camps. Right? Countries cannot be leveraged by the big powers or cornered by the big powers to take a stance on which camp they're in. They do business with everyone. They do politics with everyone. They do culture with everyone. Right? Today, India, if you just take their example, gets the majority of their defense production from Russia, but at the same time has a strong political relationship with the United States, right? I mean, Trump just went to India and slashed most of the tariffs by half, right? They have a constant hostility with China. They have border disputes with China actively, but at the same time, they do, a lot of their trade with China. They have a strong economic relationship, right? At the same time, they have a defense sharing agreement with Israel. They get a lot of their cybersecurity from there. They rely on them in the Middle East. And at the same time, they're a champion for the global south, where Palestine is a central issue. You see, you can't box India into deciding on one camp or another, because we've lost that leverage over the middle power countries. And in an environment like this, if you're an Indian, you're living in a country that is growing at 6 or 7% a year. You're living in a country that has 72% public support for the head of state, right? Agree or disagree with him, that represents a sense of policy continuity, right? That Narendra Modi has had for 10 plus years now and is not going to go away. You live in a country that's double the amount of airports in a decade, right? That builds 10,000 kilometers of highways a year. There's no ghost cities in India the way there are with China, right? There's immense appetite for investment. And so basically, you live in a country that has all these factors. If you look throughout history, any country that has a decent GDP growth, political stability, a young population, 40% of India is under 25, has immense appetite for government-led investment. No country like this has ever failed throughout world history, ever, right? We have no precedents of this. And I just use India as one example to paint a story of lots of the other countries that are following suit, right? Indonesia is in the same bucket, has a good relationship with Russia, has a good relationship with the US, and increasingly with China, right? Same for the Gulf powers that are rising to prominence this year, last year, and the next couple of years to come, right? These are the geopolitical swing states that I think should not be ignored and are actually the big opportunity in a world where we see geopolitical fragmentation as the norm. Right? These are the three stories that I want you to take away about how geopolitics is going, about Trump, the 5-step swing framework, and the national security strategy, about Europe, about the 3 threats of the far right in Europe, and whatever you think politically about what those mean for European unity, for the EU as an institution, and for policy continuity, and of the geopolitical swing states, right? This sort of nebulous group of countries that don't exist in a multipolar world, that exist with their own agency, interacting with all sorts of sides that are fundamentally multi-aligned, right? These are the 3 stories defining geopolitics today. Thank you very much.